Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to move markets, countries, and economies like never before. So we created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephanie Flanders.
And I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And as I know we all know by now, President Joe Biden has confirmed he will not seek nomination for the 2024 presidential campaign. That statement was released on Sunday afternoon, US time, led to an outpouring of respect and thanks to him for making this decision, which an awful lot of people have been begging him to make for several weeks since that terrible performance in the debate. We're going to try, Adrian, to avoid telling people loads of things that they already know, but we did think we should focus this episode on this major change in the US presidential race and start to think about some of what might happen next. But your first thoughts on what happened on Sunday and the path forward?
Well, I think the crowning of Joe Biden as sort of Cincinnatus, as this great figure who has sacrificed himself, fallen on his sword, for the good of the Republic is rather annoying, I must say, because he fought as long as he could and as hard as he could. He had to be virtually levered out of the position, but it was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. And it does seem as though the script is playing itself out in a fairly controlled way, in the sense that Kamala Harris will be the nominee unless something very strange or very unpredictable happens. And the Democratic Party will unite behind her, and she does look, on paper at least, like quite a strong candidate, partly because she's a woman, partly because she's an ethnic minority, partly because she's young. She's 59 against a 78-year-old Trump, so it'll be the Democrats playing the age card, which the Republicans have been playing, and partly because the Democratic Party does sort of have a spring in its step at the moment. The money is pouring in. There's a lot of goodwill towards her. And a sense that they looked at defeat and decided that victory was a better option.
And we're going to say more about the situation with donors a bit later on. It was certainly stunning. There was just under $50 million in grassroots donation in the less than 24 hours since Joe Biden made that statement. And we know that there had been very little money coming in over the last few weeks as we saw this debate over his performance play out. The interesting thing, though, I mean, when a lot of the big donors, I had heard saying over the last few weeks that they were nervous about the Kamala stage of the process, that they quite wanted to get to an open process. They wanted to get to those exciting new shiny candidates who had less of the baggage of the Biden administration hanging off them. It now seems, a lot of those candidates that get talked about, whether it's Gavin Newsom or the Michigan governor, Gretchen Whitmer, immediately said that they were, came out in support of Kamala when Biden endorsed her, and a lot of that seems to be shut off. There are certainly some sort of significant senior voices who've not endorsed her, not least former President Barack Obama, but there does seem to be a head of steam around her. The sort of wild cards for the next few weeks, if you think about the sort of barely 4 weeks till the Democrat convention in Chicago, there is a lot of talk on the Republican side about legal challenges. The Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, has been saying for a few days that there will be grassroots challenge to removing Biden from the ticket. Very hard to see how those get very far, given that he's not the formal nominee yet in any state, but that doesn't mean that they won't happen and maybe delay things a bit. I think more concerning perhaps for the Democrats will be the worry that the sort of continued pressure and accusations from the Republican side about how long President Biden's condition was kept from the public and who is implicated in that, not least Vice President Kamala Harris, and whether or not, questions about whether President Biden should stay as president until November or indeed January if he is unfit as he appears to be. Do you think either of those have legs?
I think the Republicans have two very powerful arguments to make. One is the argument that if he's not capable of running for the job. He shouldn't be doing it now. And the second is that this is a sort of establishment stitch-up, which is excluding ordinary people and is a sort of an elite conspiracy. And we have, the Republican Party is now a populist party, and that's a very good populist case to make. I don't think it'll get anywhere in terms of the legal challenges. I think the legal challenge strikes me as nonsense. I mean, a candidate has the freedom to withdraw their name and, they're part of a ticket and the funds should go to the other part of that ticket. That strikes me as a very difficult thing to challenge. I think she's now the inevitable candidate. I don't think the Democratic Party can say to a black woman who has been serving as vice president, we don't want you to run. However, I think she's a weak candidate. She shouldn't have been the vice president for an aging president. She's not very articulate. She's not got a very substantial political career. She's not done very much as vice president. Her teams around her seem to disappear or fall out. She's not very good at managing people. She's not an impressive debater. She may surprise us all, but when she ran for president in her own right, it was a disaster.
Okay, so the pushback to that, which obviously we've heard more of in the last few weeks, as a lot of Democrats have sort of thought about the implications of going further, going beyond Kamala Harris. One is, even if we think on paper that there are better candidates, Gretchen Whitmer, for example, or Gavin Newsom, is the incremental benefit of those lesser known but fresh faces large enough to justify the risk of sort of chaos on the path to getting there? I think the answer to that's probably no. I think there's also, if you look back at the sort of Kamala's underrated argument, says if you go back to that campaign, that was indeed a very weak campaign and she didn't get very far in the primaries, remember that the 2020 election campaign was a very peculiar one. It was dominated by not least COVID, but Black Lives Matter. And she had this reputation as a prosecutor who'd been very tough on crime, was controversial in California as a prosecutor in that feverish environment, in that kind of anti-police environment. And so she was in a peculiarly kind of weak, odd position as an African American in that she never quite hit her stride in that campaign. The other argument is she's got a lot better. People say she's learnt in office, she was inexperienced then, so she's become a more seasoned campaigner.
Sure, but she's had some time as vice president, and as vice president, her record is quite dubious. She's not very articulate. She's repeatedly, underperformed in public fora. And she's not very good at running things. Her staff seems to have disappeared like snow on a hot summer's day.
It's a pretty awful job. It's a dog's job.
Yes, it is an awful dog, but Dick Cheney did it in a way that made a big difference. It is possible to do it well, particularly if your president is somebody who is somewhat tiring in the job. However, to say something positive about her at the moment, she's 2 points, I think, behind in polls for what they're worth at the moment in Donald Trump. She could improve that by a lot as the party unites behind her and starts talking about her merits. She does mobilize important demographics for the party. And above all, it looked as though this election was going to be a referendum on Joe Biden and his various failures. Now it's much more a referendum on Donald Trump. She is not the person in the spotlight. Trump will be the person in the spotlight. He will be the galvanizing figure, and he has a lot of weaknesses. There's no doubt about that she will be able to exploit.
She is quite strong and has been campaigning on the abortion issue. And with J.D. Vance, he's in favour of abolishing abortion. And in Trump's vice presidential nominee has also said previously been negative about even IVF, so that she could be a very strong campaigner against that if he continues to have that role. I think a very big argument against her and a challenge she will have is the close connection to the Biden administration. If insofar as the Biden administration has not made a strong economic case to the electorate, particularly in swing states where economics perhaps features more heavily than things like abortion or indeed sort of fear of democracy with President Trump coming back in, she will have the same problems that Biden had in making proving to people that things have been better than they thought.
Absolutely. The mood at the moment is anti-incumbent right across the world, as we've seen again and again in Britain, in India, to some extent in France. And she has the problem not only of being tied to the incumbent, but also as being tied to what the Republicans would no doubt call the cover-up. You know, she was there saying he's perfectly all right. He's as sharp as a tack. He can dance and sing and do everything imaginable. Well, it now seems that he's had a problem with cognitive awareness and with physical fitness, and that cover-up will be something the Republicans will keep going on about. Biden, I think, had no chance of winning. She certainly has a significant chance of winning, but I'd still put the betting on Trump rather than her. And I just wanted to add one more thing, which worries me, and that is that so long as the Europeans thought that Trump was pretty bound to win, they were really getting their act together in terms of taking a more responsible role in funding NATO, in funding their own defense, in acting as though the world, as though they were responsible for the state of the world. Now I'm worried that they'll say, well, Trump might well not win. Kamala may easily, not easily win, but may well come out on top. The old world may be preserved. They like to do that. They like to delay, and they may take this as an excuse to delay on important things like defense spending. And I think that would be a very bad thing. They should act as though Trump is a certainty, even if he isn't. Partly because I think he's more likely than not. Partly because the MAGA strain in republicanism is important in Congress. It will remain important, but partly because I think that the Democratic Party cannot be relied on to be the sort of internationalist party that it was perhaps traditionally. The protectionist wing is very strong. Biden pushed through quite a lot of protectionist measures, tariffs and things like that. The shift away from taking responsibility for Europe's defense goes back to Obama. In some ways, the pivot to Asia and things like that. This is a more isolationist country, whoever is on top. Obviously, Trump would be a massive game changer, but we cannot rely on America for our defense anymore. Europe needs to take a more responsible role, and in some ways, rightly so.
Well, that is a very good note of warning from you to Europe, which I hope Europe will listen to. They certainly should. I would have a bit of a sort of related warning to the sort of Trump traders, that we've had a lot in the last few weeks, in particular, as it's become apparently more and more inevitable, certainly more higher probability that President Trump would be re-elected. We would have... We've seen this kind of optimism in the markets. The market reaction since Biden said he wouldn't run has been muted, I think probably because, as you suggest, that President Trump winning is still the most likely option if you just look at the world, but also if you look at the betting odds. But I think there should also be a sort of growing understanding that there has to be a ceiling to this bull market, even especially with Donald Trump, because you look at what his tariff policies mean for inflation, what his approach to renewing his very expensive tax cuts means for US borrowing, certainly what all of that means for further interest rate cuts. If you think that a large part of the enthusiasm around the equity market has been around the prospect of money getting cheaper again, that's not going to happen in a Trump administration where inflation's going up again. The only beneficiary of all that, arguably, which is possibly the strongest Trump trade, is a stronger dollar, but that's precisely what neither Trump nor especially J.D. Vance has said he would favour. He thinks that it's been a terrible cost to the nation to have had the currency sort of over strong over these years. So I think all of that ought to play into market considerations, business considerations, and I know it plays into donor considerations over the next few weeks. And that's something that we want to get into a bit more with our sister podcast, The Big Take in DC. Gregory Korte and Laura Davison are two journalists who cover money and politics for Bloomberg, and they have done a special episode out today trying to answer the question of how much Harris's campaign could cost, what kind of edge she has in fundraising, and how Democratic donors are reacting to the news. We hope you enjoy that. Thank you for joining me, Adrian, giving your wisdom, and listen on.
after mounting pressure from members of Joe Biden's own party in Congress, and finally, reportedly from his former running mate and former president, Barack Obama, Biden released a statement saying he'd drop out of the 2024 U.S. presidential race.
Suddenly, on a Sunday afternoon, the dam broke.
That dam broke via tweet. I called up Gregory Korte, a White House and politics reporter, to get his reaction to the news.
The decision isn't a surprise, but the sudden timing of it was.
And Sarah, we got an answer to that big question, would Biden drop out? But that only raised more questions.
In addition to the decision not to run for re-election, there were a lot of decisions baked in that decision. Does he tap an heir apparent? Does he endorse Kamala Harris?
Who would donors back to replace him? Where does the Democratic Party go from here?
And not long after his first announcement, Biden tweeted an endorsement of Harris. But that endorsement now kicks off an entirely new phase of the election, which means there are even more unknowns.
The Democratic National Convention is just 1 month away. Voters will go to the polls in less than 4 months. Even if Harris clinches the nomination in Chicago in August, is there time for her to fundraise and advertise herself to the American people? How much money does a candidate really need to campaign successfully if they're taking over the ticket so late in the year?
One of my first thoughts was, it's going to be a long 3 or 4 months now.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura.
And I'm Sarah Holder. Today on the show, I dig into these questions with Gregory and with money and politics editor Laura Davison. As of Sunday evening, just hours after President Biden's announcement, not much was known about how he made the decision and how he thought about timing its release. I asked Gregory Korte and Laura Davison about that.
It's hard to say because he kept counsel only with a very small inner circle of aides on this. We're getting reporting that even his own campaign staff was blindsided by this announcement. He may have been waiting until after the Republican convention for things to settle. He was in seclusion for the past few days, recovering from a COVID infection. So he may have been waiting to see if he could ride that out and come back.
It's really important to note that in the past, essentially 3 weeks since the debate that really sparked all these concerns, Democratic donors have basically said, look, we are freezing contributions to your campaign. There have been a handful of donors who have come out and said, I'm still with the president. But most folks said, look, we're not going to throw good money after bad. We want this guy out. And our leverage as donors is money. So you saw, a bunch of different efforts. Some donors start different super PACs that they said would, start collecting money that would go to whoever the eventual new nominee is. And this all came at a very critical moment when Trump had a ton of new donor support. Folks like Elon Musk and Timothy Mellon were coming in with really large donations, and they realized that, look, this is not a tenable situation here.
This moment feels unprecedented, and people are already reacting all around the world. How do you expect markets to react?
We do know that in the past couple of weeks, as Trump has seemingly grown stronger in his bid, that markets have started to price a Trump win in. So that looks like, a potential, increase in tariffs, particularly targeted at Chinese goods, but all sorts of goods. Markets are also anticipating a pretty large tax cut if it's Trump. Anytime there is a seismic shift in what U.S. leadership looks like, there will be market reactions.
So as part of his announcement, Biden endorsed Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party nominee. Does it mean Biden's campaign is shutting down immediately and Harris's is now jumping into action? What happens next, Gregory?
Presumably, if Biden has his way and Vice President Harris has hers, she will take now the top spot of that ticket and recommend to the delegates at the convention next month who her choice for vice president would be, her running mate. She would get to keep that sizable war chest that Biden has built, but he started to burn through cash in the past month or so, and it's not quite as formidable as they would like. So the first order of business is to rebuild that war chest, get some big donors on board through super PACs, and then it will be up to the vice president, if it is her as the nominee, to decide how she wants to structure her campaign. But there's really not a whole lot of time, right, to completely blow up the campaign. It already has field offices. It's already bought a lot of ad time. That strategy is going to have to change very quickly, of course, now that there's a new candidate at the top of the ticket. So a lot of these things we're going to just have to see in the coming days how that all comes to pass.
Just how much money is currently in the Biden campaign coffers compared to Trump?
So just on the raw dollar total, they're not too far apart. So the Biden campaign has $96 million. The Trump campaign has $128 million. So Trump is ahead, not a massive amount. The thing that's the real differentiator here is that Biden's fundraising has totally fallen off a cliff. The other thing is just how much they're spending. In the month of June, this is even, before a lot of the debate stuff started percolating, Democrats spent 93% of the money that they brought in compared to Trump, who was spending less than half. So just the burn rate there is a massive difference.
The Trump forces have been spending next to nothing. They have a super PAC that spent money in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and now has just gone into Arizona. But they've been marshaling their resources, really sort of hoarding their cash while Biden has gotten out early. All that money now, I don't want to say it's wasted money because it helped perhaps the Democratic brand, but it was money that was spent to promote Biden. And now Democrats have to figure out a new branding, a new message now that the nominee will be somebody else.
And Laura, how is the Trump camp reacting to this news?
There's a couple different schools of thought within the Trump campaign. Just last night, he had a rally in Michigan where he talked about some of the disarray that was happening with Democrats. Of course, this was before Biden announced that he would be dropping out. But Trump, at the top of his rally, essentially polled the crowd and said, basically, who do you want to be, our opponent? Do you want it to be Joe Biden? Do you want it to be Kamala Harris? And so the crowd overwhelmingly, by a show of voices, indicated that they wanted Biden to be the nominee, a clear sign that at least, Trump supporters think that he is an easier candidate to beat. However, we know that the Trump campaign for weeks has been preparing that it may be Kamala or it may be someone else in the race that they're running against. So they've started working on messaging.
What are we hearing about how Democratic donors are reacting to Biden's announcement and whether they'll rally behind Kamala Harris versus someone else?
So there's really two camps of donors right now. One, some of the major donors who are coming out and saying, look, we support Harris. These are folks like George Soros and his son, Alexander Soros, saying we're going to support Harris and, what she needs to run. There's another group of donors. I'll note that these are less major donors. These are people who give maybe up to $1 million, but still have an influential voice within the party and are very vocal. And they're saying, hold on a second. We want to make sure there's some sort of open nominating process. We want to have either a primary or an open convention. And this is going to be a debate that plays out over the next couple days, and whether those loud vocal voices saying they want some sort of way to choose the nominee versus have it just going to Harris automatically, if they win out, this could be very messy. And you could have a lot of different candidates rise to the fore, each siphoning off a little bit of donor money, but not having donors unite behind one candidate. This is the exact problem that Republicans had on their side of after 2022. The major party donors said, we don't want to have Trump as our nominee. We should all pick a candidate and, give to that candidate and we could defeat Trump. That never happened. First, it looked like it might be DeSantis, then maybe Nikki Haley, but Trump at that point was too powerful and, had enough support within the party base. A similar thing could happen with Harris if the donors don't decide and it's clear that the party leadership and the base of the party is moving with Harris. She could be the nominee and donors are going to have to line behind because they just won't have any options at that point.
After the break, we dig into what an open convention could look like and the financial problems that could face the eventual nominee, including how much money a new candidate would need to launch a successful campaign in under 4 months. We're back. I've been talking with White House and politics reporter Gregory Korte and money and politics editor Laura Davison about what we currently know about President Biden's decision to drop out of the 2024 race. But what comes next? The open convention scenario sounds chaotic, perhaps, but could any of this upheaval actually energize donors? Could donors who have thus far sat on the sidelines get activated to actually start donating more to the Democratic Party?
That's the argument that some of these donors make and said, look, they're particularly arguing for a more moderate candidate. Have someone who's maybe a little bit more business friendly. Have someone who appeals to some of those people who are never Trumpers on the Republican side. You could bring a lot of money in. Right now, that's all theoretical. There's no one who's coming forth and saying, look, I'm going to pledge, X million dollars if it is a certain candidate. Everyone is sort of seeing where the political winds are blowing. And just the way that the calendar moves, these decisions have to be made soon. This is not something that can play out over a couple weeks or months. It's almost a first mover advantage here.
One of the games that modern campaigns play is that they try to raise a lot of money around events to kind of signal that they have the momentum. So I would expect the Harris campaign, now that there is one, to come out in the next few days and give us a total of exactly how many millions of dollars she's raised in a very short period of time, to kind of give the impression that there's a snowball effect, that people are rallying around her campaign, that she does have the ability to raise that small dollar donor. And sometimes small dollar donors follow small dollar donors. If people see that there is momentum behind a candidate, that might encourage even more people to jump in.
Already, we're seeing that tactic in action. As of 9 p.m. Eastern on Sunday night, the Democratic fundraising platform ActBlue announced it had received over $46 million in donations from small dollar donors, just since Biden officially endorsed Harris. Laura, supporters of Harris have been saying that one of her biggest assets is her access to Biden's war chest, that $96 million we were talking about earlier. How does the process work now? Does the Harris campaign inherit all that money automatically? Or could it go to another nominee?
If it is Harris as the nominee, yes, she would be able to inherit the $96 million or so that is left in the account. She's able to operate a lot more seamlessly than if it's another candidate. So she is able to keep on staff. People could keep their email addresses. If, in fact, it is another candidate, they have to start a campaign committee, essentially the thing you file with the FEC to say, hey, I'm running for president. They have to start a brand new campaign. That campaign will have $0 in it. The $96 million that's left in the Biden campaign, they can either donate that to the Democratic National Committee or to a super PAC, which presumably would then go to support that new candidate ultimately. But, at least in their campaign account, they'll have $0. So they'll immediately have to start fundraising. There are a bunch of fundraising limitations. So for just an individual donor, the most they could give to that campaign is just a couple $1,000s. So that you've got to go out and bring in a lot of money. You need to bring in a lot of grassroots money. You would need to have all of the super PACs working with you. Imagine a startup. This is what the campaign would be doing, of just, getting staff hired, getting office space, doing all of these things, and it would take them weeks to just get up on the ground and running, stuff that the campaign in a normal year would have been doing, a year or even 2 years ago.
How much money will they need to run an effective campaign over the next few months?
So Biden and his team, and kind of allies were talking about that they need at least $1 billion, if not more, to run this campaign. Biden and his, allies raised about $1 billion in 2020. So far, the Biden campaign, to date, and, along with the DNC, has spent just a little bit over $350 million. But of course, the spending really, really ramps up, as you head into Election Day. The Democrats have created a strategy that's pretty expensive. They have a lot of field offices with a lot of staff. They are running a lot of advertising, tens of millions of dollars, in any given month or week. They're going to need a lot of money if they're going to continue the strategy. And because they're going to be introducing a new candidate and a new vice presidential candidate to the public, they're going to need to continue that money.
Bloomberg has reported that Harris has been having meetings with Wall Street executives recently, and from her days in California politics, she has her own ties to Silicon Valley and the tech industry. How might she leverage those relationships?
Harris is very lucky because she comes from California, which is called a donor state, in that, it's California really funds Democratic runs across the country. So she has close ties to Silicon Valley. She is a known entity there. People know her name. Being vice president, she's also been able to operate a little bit more under the radar than Biden. So she's been taking these meetings with folks on Wall Street to explain some of the Biden policies. She started to build those relationships. Remember, she's only 59 years old. So she's always had an eye to what she would do after she was Biden's vice president, knowing that she needs to have Wall Street support. She needs to have some of these ties to the business community.
At least among some of the Wall Street donors, there is an ideological divide here, that Harris is perceived as perhaps to the left of Biden. When she ran in 2020, there was a concerted effort among some Democratic donors to find a more moderate candidate. Remember, Bernie Sanders was in that race, Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris was somewhere on the spectrum between Biden and those more liberal candidates, probably a little bit more towards the progressive side. She was for Medicare for all, for example. She was for a number of different policies that she's now had to subsume Biden's policies as his vice president. But there might be some concern from some Wall Street donors of what they're going to get in a future Harris administration.
In recent weeks, new PACs have popped up that are open about fundraising for a non-Biden candidate. Do we know how much money those PACs have raised at this point?
We don't know exactly how much money is in them because they've just sprung up in the past couple of days or weeks. One of the ones, Mike Novogratz of Galaxy Digital, his PAC, this is a couple weeks old now at this point, but said it raised about $2 million sort of in the initial days after forming. In the next 24, 48 hours, I anticipate we'll see a lot of donors come forward either with actual money or with commitments to give to whether it's, Vice President Harris or another candidate should someone else throw their hat in the ring. And that will be a key determiner of who really has the juice to mount a run here.
As we've been talking about, a Harris candidacy is not a foregone conclusion, despite Biden's announcement that he will endorse her. The Democratic National Convention is in 1 month. Is there still a chance that Democrats might choose someone besides Harris at the convention, Gregory?
That's absolutely possible under the convention rules, but practically speaking, it seems to me that any other candidate would have to get out there relatively quickly before the institutional Democratic Party really rallies around Harris. We're already seeing endorsements from former President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. We're starting to see the Congressional Black Caucus and other really important stakeholders rally around Harris. She has important support from important constituencies in the Democratic Party. And so it would take a lot for somebody to dislodge her from that perch. And somebody's going to have to come in with a pretty aggressive campaign and a lot of money pretty soon to signal that this is going to be an open process. Otherwise, I would expect Democrats to really circle the wagons around Harris.
Assuming Harris gets the nomination, what is the process for Harris to choose her running mate? And how much you try to leverage that decision to bring in additional funding?
We saw this on the Republican side just this past week when Donald Trump chose J.D. Vance as his running mate, and he did so really at almost the last possible moment before the roll call even happened. So there is time for that to happen. We might expect for Harris to wait until closer to the convention when it's clear that she has the votes, although she could come up with a ticket earlier than that to kind of try to figure out how to unify the party, maybe pick somebody from a different wing of the party, maybe a governor. Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky's name has come up. The governors from Michigan and Maryland and Pennsylvania and California, all of whom could be potential running mates. One potential path would be to select as a running mate somebody who is already independently wealthy and can write the campaign a big check. You can self-fund your campaign. It's not subject to limits. And one name that could come into play in that kind of a scenario is J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, who is independently wealthy. He's a billionaire, inherited a lot of money from his family's hotel and real estate empire, worked in venture capital, and was very influential in getting the convention to come to Chicago in his home state by helping to support that effort monetarily, and could do the same if he were on the ticket.
For more on the political fallout from Biden's decision, the market reaction, and the next steps for the Harris campaign, head to Bloomberg.com. Thanks for listening to the Big Take podcast from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Julia Press. It was mixed by Alex Sugiura and fact-checked by Adriana Tapia. Naomi Shaven is a senior producer and edited this episode. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer, and Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Please follow and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts.